So welcome everyone. I'm Claudia Rea. I'm the Senior Associate Director for PK-12 at the Jamil World Education Lab. This webinar is part of a series that we launched in collaboration with Learning at Scale. This is a conference that will be happening in August, and we have more information about it. This is the third webinar we do as part of the series, and as part of the work that we do at Learning at Scale in the conference, that is really about, or has been for the most part, about learning at scale, MOOCs, higher education. We decided to do this series in light of COVID-19 and actually our conference moving to an online version for this year. So we wanted to really highlight what we have learned so far about learning at scale, that research, but also highlight some of the current work that is happening as a result of COVID-19 and the crisis in education. I think at some point in April, about 90%, a few more, 90% of learners from K-12 to higher education were out of school in some type of remote learning. So we launched this series. We hope that you enjoyed this the talk today with David Joyner. David is the executive director of wait a minute, having problems here with my computer. David Joyner is the executive director of the online education and online master in science at computer science program at Georgia Tech. His research focuses on online education and learning at scale, especially as both of them intersect with for credit offerings at the graduate and undergraduate level. His research has an emphasis in designing learning experiences that leverage the opportunities of online learning to compensate for the loss of synchronous co-locate class time. This includes leveraging artificial intelligence for students' support and assignment evaluation, facilitating student communities in large online classes, and investigating strategies for maintainable and interactive presentations of online instructional materials. So that's the work that David is doing at Georgia Tech. The talk today is about safe, familiar, student-centric, and is an approach for novice teaching in remote environments. So welcome, David. It's great to have you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claudia. So like Claudia said, my name is David Joyner. I work at Georgia Tech. And this guide has been evolving over the past several weeks as we've gathered more information about what works and what doesn't. So Claudia already introduced me, but I want to talk a little bit about how my roles intersect with what in the world I'm going to talk about today. So one of my roles is I'm executive director of Georgia Tech's online MSCS program, which had 9,800 students spring, and we're getting ready to welcome our largest incoming class ever in fall. So we're really, really big. As far as I know, we're the biggest of our kind. If anyone knows of a bigger one, please let me know so I can stop embarrassing myself by saying we're the largest of our kind. So we have about 45 classes, deliver our MSCS program completely online, completely asynchronously, built for working professionals, built for people around the world. Yeah, that's part of it. I'm also the instructor for 5 online CS courses. 4 of them are in that online master's program, and one of them is actually our online undergraduate class. Generally speaking, our online undergraduate class is taken by students who are on campus, but they take that class online for the flexibility or for various different reasons. Lately it's been different because lately everything's online. So lately it's been the class that was online before being online was cool. So it's the class that was also built to be more deliberately online. I've had about 15,000 students in the past 5 years because our classes are at scale. My largest class will usually be over 800 or 900. My smallest class is usually in the lower 200s, maybe. And I share all that because I think that gives a unique insight into some of the things that go into teaching online, both in a good way and a bad way. One is that I completely live in this online world, and in our courses, generally speaking, when we're rolling up a new course, we devote 6 to 9 months of dedicated development time and things like that with instructional technologists and graphic designers and people like that to develop a really high quality course. And that's not the situation anyone finds themselves in right now. Right now, everyone needs to go online, and everyone needed to do it when I started writing this guide in about, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So it's a very different world. But some of the things that we've also discovered, I think, apply in interesting ways, especially where there are opportunities to take advantage of some technologies online, some communities that emerge online that are pretty general across remote courses. As I've been having these conversations with people around our institute and around other institutes, it's become clear that there's a lot of stuff that we know that others took for granted. Like, I didn't know you could do insert some basic functionality online. And then there's also things that we really had very little idea about. One of the big ones that's come up has been the idea of, facilitating a large lecture classroom live when you're talking to 65 people live, like I am right now. And that's not something we ever did. And so it's not something we had a lot of expertise to lend, but we had some expertise in talking about whether or not that was the right way to think about it, and how to try to combine some of the advantages of being online with some of the things that we're used to doing in person. So I share all that to say that there's some unique insights here, I think. There's some things that might seem obvious to me that will be surprising to others. There are some things that I think are really novel and interesting that you'll think, I've been doing that for 15 years. Why does he think that's novel? I think that's been my biggest takeaway from this whole crisis has been, at least as far as it relates to online education, is that there's so much going on in so many different places, and what is completely groundbreaking and novel in one place has been the way of doing things for 20 years in another place. And part of having these conversations, I think, is starting to understand who has gone for it first, who has explored things first, and come to a better community knowledge of everything to do. So this guide is written mostly with that emergency transition to online teaching in mind. I should ask, y'all can see my slides, right? I'm looking at my presentation, assuming that you can see them. Okay, good. So it's written with the novice who's teaching online for the first time in mind. It was originally written with someone who needed to do it like right now in mind. Now I think we have a little bit more flexibility. Either you're already doing it right now in summer, or you're getting ready to do it in fall. So you have a little bit more time. You don't have that long development cycle that we have with some of our courses, but you do have a little bit more time. Pardon my cats in the background, by the way. I would lock them out, but if you have cats, you know that the quickest way to get them to be even more disturbing is to lock them out of the room. So I'm gonna let them stay back there. So in writing this and in discussing with people what they should do as they switch to teaching online in kind of an emergency situation, I come into it with 3 assumptions. And the assumptions I think are a little bit different, because a lot of the materials I've read about teaching online have been very much about, this is a great, wonderful place and welcome to online teaching, and there's so many cool things you can do, which is all completely true. And I wholeheartedly encourage everyone to check out all the really cool things you can do when you're teaching online once you're not doing this in a crisis mode. With everything that's going on right now, my assumptions are that most of you would want to keep things safe, keep things familiar, and keep things student-centric. And by that I mean, for safety, what I mean is that we really, when we're dealing with unfamiliar technologies and things like that, we want to minimize the risk of a high-profile error or failure. If you're on social media or anything like that, you'll see students posting about how it was hilarious how they attended a lecture and the instructor forgot to turn on his microphone for the first 40 minutes. We want to avoid those kind of things. We want to keep it familiar. There are great, awesome tools out there that I encourage everyone to experiment with when you have the flexibility and the freedom and the time to do so. Right now, I'm assuming that most of us want to stick with things that are pretty familiar or things that are supported by our local institutions. Partially that's for us, for our safety, for our comfort, and partially that's also for students. They're already going through so many things, and adding on a bunch of new tools on top of the fact that now you have to figure out where you're going to attend class in your hometown or with your subpar internet connection or anything like that is just a lot to add onto them. So we want to keep it as familiar as possible, and we want to keep things student-centric in the sense that we want to keep things simple where possible, well organized so students know what's expected of them, and wherever possible give students the benefit of the doubt. That was especially true, I think, in spring, where this was really a very sudden emergency kind of shift. I think it's still true now, though. I think right now we have the risk of underestimating how much students remain impacted by things as some areas shift back to normalcy. but the normalcy that's emerging is not the normal we had before. And so I think we risk taking for granted in that. So in thinking about this process, by the way, I should say, I told Nina at the beginning, I have several monitors in front of me. I have my chat monitor up here. So if you have any questions and you want to interrupt, feel free to send it along, and I'll read it live. Hey, Chris, one of my former students and TAs is here. That's awesome. So in talking about teaching online, I generally break it into three things to think about. You can break it in lots of different ways. These are three ways I think about it. I think of a core content kind of perspective of what is the core information, the core knowledge, the core behaviors, the core skills that you're trying to communicate. There's the assessment component, which is how you know whether students actually are doing that. And then there's the administration component. And I find that one interesting because content and assessment are the ones we think about when we teach online. We think about how am I going to teach that content that I teach live? How am I going to assess them if they're not in the same room with me? Things like that. Administration are those things very often that happen naturally when you're teaching online. I'm sorry, that happen naturally when you're teaching in person that need to be done online. But if you're not really aware of them, you can easily just not even consider the fact that was a component when you're teaching in person. So hopefully that'll make more sense when I get to that, start babbling about it. So as far as content, my recommendation, and this was my recommendation early on, and I've revised it a little bit as we've gone along based on the feedback I've gotten, is to actually use asynchronous content delivery for the core critical content that you really want students to understand. I shared that initially when we started this transition, in part because everyone tended to default to live presentations. And there are some classes for which live presentations are the best thing to do. But I think that for many classes, when we default to that approach, we underestimate some of the challenges and we underestimate some of the opportunities to doing something more asynchronous. My recommendation is to use asynchronous content delivery for the core critical content, which means filming the lecture in advance without a live audience for a variety of reasons. The biggest one, I think, is that especially if you're experimenting with new technology, it allows you the freedom to safely experiment and try again and only put out a product that you're actually comfortable with. You don't have to worry about embarrassing yourself live. You don't have to worry about technical issues. You don't have to worry about misspeaking or forgetting something. You don't have to push it out until you're really comfortable with it, which is really powerful because when you're dealing with a new technology, it's easy to underestimate how much thought you're putting into the technology and how that's detracting from your thinking about the content itself. And so then you present live and you go back and if you record it, your live presentation, you watch back and you realize that you're not doing things quite as dynamically or thoroughly as you would in person. And it's because you're spending so much time attending to the technology. So it gives you that freedom to preview. It gives you the freedom to try again. I also like that it reduces the time constraints around content delivery. We've, for most of us who've been teaching for a while, we've grown so accustomed to, my class meets 3 times a week for 45 minutes and things like that. So I fit my content into those blocks. But a lot of times your content doesn't naturally fit in those. Sometimes you're teaching something that takes 10 minutes to teach. And now you can do that. Now you're liberated if you do this asynchronous kind of approach from the constraints of a particular schedule, a particular time slot kind of thing. And so you can actually find what works best for your content. And we also know that for students, it's great if we can deliver them content that they can consume in small bites and then immediately, practice, which is difficult to do in person because if you're teaching a field, like a math class, for example, where it takes 20 minutes to work a problem and you teach, the approach and then you ask students to do it, if you wait for all the students to complete the problem, you've lost half of your class time right there, just waiting for them to work independently, which is, a scarce amount of class time is not something you can reasonably do. But we know that's a good way to teach. Online, you get to actually go back and do that. You can say, watch this 10-minute video and then go do this 1-hour practice problem, and then come back and do a little bit more instruction. You actually have more freedom to build that if you do this asynchronous approach. I also find it's more compatible with students' new normal in the sense that your students, when they were cast to the wind and had to return to their homes, may be in places where to attend your 10 a.m. Wednesday lecture is actually 7 a.m. their time if they're in Pacific time and you're in Eastern, or it's the middle of the night if they're an international student. And this approach makes it so that it's more compatible with whenever they are available, as well as being aware of some of the differential impacts of this crisis on different families. I think many teachers, as we shifted to this, were under the assumption that, okay, I used to teach 10:30 to 11:45 Monday, Wednesday, Friday. My students will sign on 10:30 to 11:45 Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Except those students are now at home with their siblings who also have to attend class 10:30 to 11:45 Monday, Wednesday, Friday, without an internet connection that can stream for 4 people to attend a lecture, or without computers for everybody. Maybe they're relying on the university infrastructure, and now they're excuse me, sharing one computer with several siblings. So it's more accommodating of some of the flexibility that they need, and it relies on some more familiar tools. I think if you've never presented live via BlueJeans or something like that, or via Zoom, it can be intimidating, especially when you read the horror stories of Zoom bombing and things like that. And it lets you just stick to kind of vanilla video recordings. Turn on your webcam, record a video, upload the video to YouTube or wherever, and it's a lot more natural for what you're accustomed to doing. So those are my recommendations for content. In terms of how you actually do this, I have a 7-step process.
I have a question, David, just to clarify, because I feel like it's one thing when a student is signing up for an online course like you described. You're running these large courses and they already know that this is the expectation. I think, and I'm speaking for personal, as a personal experience, but having some of this critical content be something that you record and all of these things, I went almost like check, but I feel like sometimes, I don't know if it takes some used to, but people were not necessarily preparing that, and we made the assumption that they will go through that content before. So is that something that you create as a culture? Do you have recommendations of how to do it? Maybe it's not something that you expect, but you recommend after you meet face to face. Like, what are the recommendations? How do you go through that barrier?
I think that so my recommendation, actually, it's perfectly timed because that's actually the 7th step of the 7-step process. Is that there's a risk of basically saying, I recorded my content, I uploaded it, and now it's there, which, in the interest of full disclosure, is the way we deliver our classes in my master's program. They're all completely asynchronous. And that's partially for our audience. We know they're working adults. We know that they're very, very scattered in terms of when they can complete the material. And we know they're adults with the self-regulation and the maturity to manage their own learning as a graduate program. So if you can't do that, then you can leave. It's a little bit different when you're at the undergrad level or even lower, when we have more of a responsibility to usher students along. But I think there is that temptation of just, recording your content, preparing it, editing it, uploading it, and saying it's there, go watch it whenever you want. The 7th step that I recommend is exactly that, is to not leave it at that, but to actually then deliver it. So instead of just uploading material, making it available, and just letting it out, then you use that synchronous class time that was probably scheduled for your class to deliver it. And as you're recording that material, you build in breakpoints, you build in moments to have conversations or discussions or take questions or things like that. And then when you have that synchronous class time, you then play that video, your nice pre-prepared video, you answer questions in the chat. So you're already kind of doubling your time because you can both present the content and answer Q&A at the same time instead of having to pause to do one or the other. And then you also generate something for people to have going forward, while still having something of that live interaction, that live back and forth, that community that can emerge based on this shared experience. And so I think it's an approach that really does get you the best of both worlds. You give students something that they're expected to do live. They're expected, if at all possible, to attend live. So they can have these conversations, they can ask these questions live, so they can get their questions answered. Perhaps you do small group interactions with breakout rooms or whatever the features of your particular teleconferencing system are. But you're also building something that basically says, if you can't do that for whatever reason, you have the rolling brownouts in your area, or you're sharing your computer with 5 siblings, or you're working on the farm during the day, someone in the chat box said, just because you can't attend during those live lecture times, you're not completely locked out of the content. You're able to go back and watch it asynchronously. You're able to do that later. So it brings, I think, it's about only forcing students to make those compromises that they really need to make. Just because not everyone can attend a live lecture doesn't mean some people can't and won't benefit from it. So you make it so that those who are able to do that are able to interact live, and those who are not able to still have an avenue into the content. And you make sure those expectations are clear to them, that if you're not able to attend live, this is what needs to be watched when, and things like that. I think it's a way of kind of only asking each individual student to give up as much as they need to do what's necessary to succeed. So it's interesting. When we first started this rapid transition, I kind of threw that in as an afterthought of, hey, maybe someone should try experimenting with this. You can play a video via Zoom or BlueJeans and find out what happens. And that's probably been the most appreciated thing of anything we've suggested that people have liked, is that idea of becoming the host of your material kind of thing. So you have your nice prepared version, but then you get to be kind of casual and social with your students because you're there live and you're acting with them live, taking their questions live. So I think it's ended up being a nice approach for those who've tried it. I kind of talked around the question. I don't know if I actually answered it, but hopefully I threw enough at the wall that was in that general scheme. So the 7 steps I'll just mention real quick. It's mostly what you would expect. It's to select your content, prepare slides or your whiteboard or your whatever it is that you present. If you're doing simulations, for example, you might set it up so you can record it pretty quick. You recorded it. You might edit it. I put edit kind of in quotation marks sometimes because edit can make people think of like Adobe Premiere and all the fancy software to add the graphics and the 3D animations and all the cool stuff, which is great if you can use it. When I say edit, I mean my cat jumped on my desk halfway through my recording, and instead of having to do the entire lecture again, I edit out that moment where I yell at my cat to get off my desk while I'm recording, or maybe I keep that because my students will love that. But editing at this point is really just, it's giving you the freedom while you're recording to say, wow, I'm out of breath. I'll pause for 2 minutes and come back and continue, which I would love to do right now because I'm out of breath and I'd love to pause for 2 minutes. It's funny, the last time I actually gave an earlier version of this talk, it was presented in this model where I recorded it and then we presented it later. And that was my first time experiencing this method, which was interesting because the first time I was experiencing something I was recommending was in a presentation recommending it. But it really was quite liberating to be able to just sit there, chat with people while they were watching this presentation, and have this kind of 2 channels of communication. And then sharing your content and communicating it to make students very well aware of just what's expected at what time. I've seen courses that just kind of make all the videos available and don't give it any kind of schedule. And I highly recommend making content available as it's ready, but I think students need expectations on what they're actually supposed to watch and when. Otherwise, they either just put it off until the day before the test and won't succeed, or they get overwhelmed because they think, oh my gosh, I need to watch all the videos that are available during the first week, when the videos are the entire class. So that's the content part. That's my recommendations, at least. I highly recommend reading the chat because I think some of y'all have had experience with many of these things and can tell me also what does work, what doesn't work, things like that. Someone did mention internet bandwidth, and one of my favorites is I have students who live in areas with low internet bandwidth, and what they say they do is they set their lectures to start downloading the night before they need them, let them download all night, and then the next day they watch them completely offline. And so there are ways to get some accessibility when you do this model that are difficult if you rely on a live approach. For assessment, my recommendation is to try to stick pretty close to what you usually do, actually. I think that modern technology has come far enough that most of the things we do in a regular classroom can be replicated to some approximation, even in an online classroom. And so I've mapped out several of the types of assessments you might use and what I generally recommend using. But again, many of y'all have done more of this than I have, so I recommend please share your experiences, and for me, the chat box is on my left, so that's why I'm looking over here. But please share your experiences with whatever you found has worked, because I think that's the more important thing about conversations like this, is to gather multiple viewpoints. Most of my classes, for me at least, are essay-based, which is part of the reason why they're quite easy to deliver online and at scale when you have plenty of teaching assistants. Because even on-campus students, they do the exact same thing. My students on campus will submit things to our learning management system, to Canvas for us, and they'll get their grades there, we'll do the grading there. It doesn't actually change whether the students are on campus or away. So many things actually, it's been interesting as learning management systems have taken on a very significant role in education. They've really paved the way for us to be ready to do some of these things, because we already had students doing things online that historically we would have had them do in person. It would have been more difficult, 15, 20 years ago, when we would have people turning in your essay in a box at the front of the room at the end of class or something like that. Nowadays it's much easier because they were already doing this kind of thing online. Class presentations are one that are a common thing that I've seen get thrown out when we start to go online, and I don't think people should do that. I think it's actually a very powerful thing to keep when you're doing things online. It's social, it's interactive. It reminds students that they're not in this alone. They see other students going through the same kind of things. I think building those social connections is very important. My recommended analog for this is to actually have students pre-record it, akin to how we say you might do content delivery. If they're doing a group project, it's actually very simple to do, in Zoom or BlueJeans. Just basically have them have their own meeting and record that meeting, and that becomes their presentation. And I recommend using that as an anchor for peer review or forum threads or things like that. In person, what you would have them doing is standing in front of the classroom, delivering and taking questions. Having them do that live is difficult. Handoffs between teams can be tricky. You'll spend half your time just trying to figure out why team 3 can't get their microphone to work, things like that. And also put some pressure on students. Even online, you never know who's going to take a screenshot of something or anything like that, and put some pressure on students to be perfect in a way that they don't have to be on campus, because on campus it's a little bit more transient. So I recommend doing that asynchronously, then using peer review or threads in a forum or things like that to be the analogy for that, for the Q&A that would follow those presentations. For large open-ended projects, they vary so much it's hard to give very general guidance on them. But depending on what they require, I've seen classes do live video presentations to a teacher, where the teacher is actually able to ask back and forth questions. If your project was to build a camera obscura, like we have in one of our classes, if you do this kind of live presentation, the teacher can actually ask, now take a picture like this, now do this, to demonstrate live the effectiveness of it. It could also be filmed as a presentation like anything else. Could be just design documents, things like that. And there can also be, I've seen some success with, especially with studio kind of things in an architecture area, small group presentations with other teams of students. So it's not the traditional, I'm going to present to 100 students in my class. There's 3 groups and they're going to present to each other, and there's much more back and forth interaction. And because it's smaller, it's easier to manage. It's not trying to juggle, this large body of people, and if mic is, if mic drops, there's 100 people staring at you, not being able to be heard. So it keeps things a little bit more social and more interactive. Obviously, if you're not on campus, though, you don't want to rely on expensive equipment. They no longer have those resources. I joked at the beginning that when we first started this, that you don't even want to rely on something like grab a roll of toilet paper to do this experiment, because that might be the most scarce resource wherever some students are. Hopefully we're past that. But you don't want to rely on them having anything particularly accessible, whether it's expensive or even it's not generally considered expensive, because again, you don't know the situation for some of your students. You don't know where they've gone back to. You don't know how easy it is for them to get even some things that are considered relatively routine. And I generally don't recommend team projects, or at least I didn't in the immediate aftermath of the shift. And now I still am leaning towards canceling my team project for fall, just because when you're teaching in this environment and students are so dispersed, it's very difficult to assign teams in kind of a way that keeps things fair among them, because they're going to be individually disproportionately impacted. It's one thing on campus when, if campus shuts down because a tornado blew through or something like that, all the groups are impacted equally because it was local. In this area, it's much different. You don't know which students are going to be in areas that are under complete lockdown, which students are going to be in areas that have a more sudden outbreak, things like that. So I do recommend rethinking whether you really need a team project. I think if your field really relies on those team interactions as a first class learning objective, then it's worth keeping them. But it's the kind of thing of, if the team project is more kind of a secondary benefit, or if it's more to allow you to assign bigger projects because there's a lower grading load per student, it might be a time to rethink that until things return to a little bit more normal. Time testing quizzes. Most learning management systems will facilitate this kind of thing. I don't recommend using proctoring solutions, and I'm a hypocrite because I use them a lot. I deliver probably 10,000 proctored examinations per year. And I think in my classes, they have a very important role to play, because our program being completely online and asynchronous, means that it's far more feasible that a student could get through a significant portion of the program, getting work from others, getting work online, things like that. So for us, I think it plays a very a key role. Ideally, we're in a situation right now where students are going to be taking a semester or two online. And so it's not a matter of, make or break your entire degree program based on proctored exams in this area. And so as a result, the other reason why I don't generally recommend them is they're invasive, they're complex, they're not trivial to debug and everything like that. And they create a very significant pressure on students to have an environment in which they feel comfortable that they might not have naturally because they're going to put it on camera. And I say this partially also because I think it is possible to create very trustworthy exams, very trustworthy quizzes that don't rely on that kind of proctoring solution. You can use large question pools to prevent some question sharing. You can use multiple small assessments. So I think it helps if you reduce the stakes on any individual assignment and make all your assessments open book because they're going to be open book anyway. And I think the thing that most students, my experience has been that most students want us to be very proactive about student integrity because they believe in the value of their degree. But the honest students don't want to feel like they're suffering because of the dishonest students. They don't want to feel like they're having to jump through a bunch of hoops to prove their honesty, but they do want to make sure that students aren't getting away with other things. And so everything's going to be open book anyway, because the honest students are going to know the dishonest students are going to be consulting notes anyway, and I'm suffering if I don't do that. I actually wrote a guide I wrote a guide not long ago. I'll send out a link as soon as I'm done babbling about stuff. But how to write a trustworthy, unproctored exam. It comes down to having a tight-ish time window such that you trust that most students are taking the test at the same time. A large question pool so that even if, Claudia and I are working together and, we're chatting on Slack in the other window, sharing problems, it takes us as much time to figure out which problems we have in common as it does to actually take the assessment. And a few other tricks like that I think can lend themselves to making a more trustworthy assessment, especially if you create a dynamic where the students who are going to do very well in an assessment are putting themselves at risk if they seek to help others out. You can create a time pressure so that the time required to grab some screenshots, grab some question content, and send it along to your friends before they start the exam may actually have a negative effect on your own. So, yeah. And again, I'm a hypocrite in that regard because I use it a lot. But yeah,
David, there are a couple of questions and comments that are all about testing. I think Jeff had a question about auto-grading solutions. There are questions about proctoring exams. So I don't know if you want to maybe address some of those comments and questions. I feel like some of these things for me, in terms of projects and things like that, work when you have a certain number of students that you feel like you could even go to that sort of make visible some of the nitty-gritty of the technology. When you have a big group, you don't want to do that. But I don't know if you want to read some of the questions and comments here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so it's interesting. So Jeff asked about auto grading. I use auto grading pretty extensively in one of my classes and very little in the other classes. I think it's very good in the place where auto grading also serves a student purpose, which is immediate feedback. For me, it's about helping students avoid minor errors that are very easily avoidable, giving them live feedback on that. And it saves us time as well, because the thing that it's cost us the most time to grade are the projects that have one little bug in them, and it's a CS class. So for me, it's projects have one little bug in them, and we have to try and follow up and figure out how much credit it deserves and things like that. Auto grading, I feel like, has a very good role to play when it's in that kind of student-focused area. I don't like auto grading when it's just a way of watering down assessments for the sake of scale. So if you do an essay-based test, I don't think you need to go to a multiple choice-based test just for the sake of scale. I think there's enough things we can do in other ways that it's worth keeping that rigor. But in those places where it can make our administration easier because it avoids problems that students might encounter, and where it helps them to iterate faster and get live feedback, I think it plays a great role. I've seen a lot of efforts lately towards essay auto grading, which I don't really like, even though I believe in the technology, and I believe it can probably do a good job of being pretty reliable to a human grader. What I haven't seen, except for one project, which was by a student of mine who is not here, but that'd be funny if he was here. What I've not seen from most essay-based auto grading is good feedback. So I think it's been shown in many places to be pretty reliable in terms of generating the same kind of grade a grader would have generated, but the student doesn't really have anything to learn from in that regard, because what it's actually using to generate is not the way the student thinks about their own essay. So, and then I think there was one reliable exams without proctoring in the age where you can hire someone to check to take your exam. I'll send out that link actually. So the idea of some of the tricks that go into it are having a tight enough window that the time you need to go out and find someone to help you is taking a significant amount of time away from your exam. Having a tight window so that the students in the class, when possible, now this has issues as well, so I'll say that. When you're distributing lots of time zones, what I'm about to say can be problematic. But if you're not dealing with that as much, if you're dealing with a more local situation where most of your students are at home, but they're at home in the area, to have examinations that are open for a window such that by the time one student has finished the exam, every other student has started the exam. So the window that it's open mirrors the live class meeting time. One thing that I found polarizing that I find interesting, some professors I've talked to swear by the idea of not letting students jump around in the exam. You do each question and you move on, which pedagogically I feel like has a weakness. It kind of forces you to approach the exam in a different way that may not be in your best ability as a student. But it also means that if you answer a question, you immediately have to consider the compromise of, do I want to go share this with someone else so that they can do better? But in doing so, I'm risking some time I might need later in the exam. By the time you know that you have 10 minutes left over, you're not able to go back and find earlier content. So yeah, I think there are a decent number of tricks. Now that said, if your university has access to a proctoring solution, I think they've come quite a long way. Excuse me. But I think especially in this kind of time, it's nice to not ask students to jump through those hoops. So let me look through real quick. So Bruno mentioned tutors can also use cell phones and things like that. That's also why I say make it open book, open note, because it's going to be anyway. What you want to do is make sure that the live collaboration that students very often will lean on at trying to get answers from somebody else is less feasible. And that's actually a place where small assessments, I think, can play a double role. They reduce the pressure on students, they reduce the scare factor of that 35% exam, but they also play another role, which is that if you have a sibling that was in your program 2 years before you, it's reasonable to ask her, hey, can you help me out with the final exam of this class? They'll never notice. It's a little less reasonable to say, hey, can you help me 3 days a week for the next 7 weeks? Because that's how often I do the small quizzes. So you're creating kind of a pressure to, a friction to say what you need someone to do for you to help you out, to give you an unfair advantage, is very high. And trying to create that that cost is significant. So yeah. So it's interesting, actually. So reading about the conversation about proctoring, ours is completely digital. So I think most of the ones nowadays are digital and delivered you an entire exam session as well, which if you are going to use proctoring, I quite like, because I have had the same experience with some proctoring solutions where we received, and this was a long time ago, we received a report that said, Claudia cheated at 3 minutes because she opened her phone and called someone and asked for the answer. And I have no record besides the proctor's sign off that happened. And there is the question of, knowing what goes into proctoring, knowing how many sessions someone's watching, things like that, different rules, everything like that, do I really trust this? The auditableness of the modern proctoring solutions, where I can actually go back and say to the student, hey, here's the evidence at this time, here's you Googling for an answer. There's really no doubting it. I think it's come a long way. I will say, for all the proctoring I do, I catch very few violations. I think it is more of a deterrent and a reassurance to honest students than it is a policing factor. It's basically creating some level of risk. It's saying that it's not guaranteed that you're going to get away with it. And I think if you create just a little bit of risk in that, just enough question that am I going to get in trouble for this, then you can actually see a big drop in the curve. Because if students know there's literally no way they could get caught, they're completely on their own, then you'll see students that wouldn't have cheated otherwise doing it, if nothing else, for desperation, because they know that they don't trust their classmates as much. So I'm probably going to go ahead and move on a little bit, and then I'll revisit chat questions over there as well. If I can get that to scroll. One of the tough ones we encounter is handwritten work. And there's ways to do that. I'm actually going to jump forward a little bit because I think the last couple of these are a little iffy. And there is a, not iffy, but just not as generally applicable. And most of these things are actually written up in guides in the LinkedIn profile. Everyone wants to go find these as well, especially these things for how you might do labs and things like that. So if you're in a lab class, I think there are ways to simulate the lab experience that still lets you elicit the the learning behavior that you're interested in assessing. In class participation, please don't say to students, post 5 times to the forum each week, because they will do it and they won't get anything out of it. And it makes it harder for the students who want to find people to talk to actually find real people who are interested in talking, who aren't just marking off the box. So I recommend having a participation policy that gives students a menu of ways to earn it. So if you're the kind of person who really likes to be on a forum and answer questions, be that person. If you're the kind of person who really likes to give peer reviews, be the person who gives peer reviews. So I think you can let students earn their participation points in different ways. That's that. Administration, like I said at the beginning, these are those things that happen passively on campus that we're not even really aware of, but they disappear when you go online if you don't recreate them manually. And so I share these as things, not to say how you do what you've done in person, but rather to say what you need to make sure you still do online that you might not have ever really been aware of. One is to establish a single channel for critical communication. I think one thing that bothers students the most about online classes is sometimes they don't really know where they're expected to hear from professors and how often. And, you know, she posted an answer to a student's question 3 days ago. Am I required to read every answer she posts on the forum or no, or things like that? Creating expectations for students of anything that you need to know, I will post in this channel and I will post it with this much lead time, reassure students that, you know, if I check the Canvas announcements once every 2 days, I know I have not missed anything. I'm not in this constant state of, is something happening right now? There's something I'm supposed to be paying attention to, kind of thing, because otherwise that can happen. I think one thing that happens when you go online is there's this perception of now needing to always be on and always be in communication. And that just wears on people, that constant need to be looped in, or to feel like you're supposed to be looped in, or worried about whether or not you're missing something. So this reassures students that as long as you do X and Y, you're up to date on the material. For me, it's you're responsible for everything on this syllabus, here's the syllabus, and everything I post is an announcement within 48 hours. If you check the syllabus and you check the announcements every 2 days, you are up to date, period. The second is an idea that I've grown to appreciate more and more over the years. When you teach in person, the regular class meeting schedule gives you a cadence. It gives you a pacing. It gives students an expectation. If you meet once a week, then that's kind of their expectation of this is a once a week class followed by a week of, you know, of off time. If you meet 3 times a week, it kind of creates an expectation of what the week is like. And that can go away online when you just make everything available, especially if you do this asynchronous model and you don't do live presentations. Creating that kind of feel for the class cadence is very important. And the 2 ways I recommend doing that, one is to focus on creating a easily memorable deadline policy. For me, it's Sunday at 11:59 anywhere on Earth time. If anything is ever due, that is when it's due. And so if it's Wednesday and you're in one of my classes, you know you're 4 days away from the assignment deadline, no matter what, Thursday. You know you're 4 days away. I've seen classes that'll have, you know, this is due on Tuesday and that's due on Thursday and that's due on Wednesday. And what I believe happens is it forces students to spend more time thinking about the class than thinking about the content of the class. They're too busy keeping up with the schedule and keeping up with the deadlines to actually think about the content they're supposed to be learning. So by creating something that just feels very intuitive, that they can recite off the top of their heads, they can focus more on the content. And then maintaining a regular announcement schedule is trivial, but it's the single thing that we've done that students have most praised. It's just every Monday, it used to be morning, now it's evening because most students are on in the evening, I'll post an announcement that just says, hey, it's week 7. Remember, this is the week that this assignment is due. Your test will open next week. Remember, we're 2 weeks away from the project deadline, and things like that. And what it really does is it inverts the information relationship. It means that instead of relying on students to pull all the necessary information at the right time, it pushes it to them. And I'll even say, if you keep up with that announcement, you're not going to miss anything, because I'm confident enough that that it replicates the syllabus closely. Theory of expectations, I recommend modeling good behavior. Social norms online and online classrooms are still under development a bit. And so students don't always know, am I allowed to ask this kind of question? Am I allowed to share my code? Am I allowed to do this? So one is to actually set explicit expectations on what they're allowed to do and how they should spend their time. So I actually tell them, you should spend this much of your time each week reading the course papers. If you're spending less, then you might need to go more depth, or you're a fast reader. If you're spending more, then you might need to brush up on how to read a paper efficiently and things like that. But then for actually like form behavior and things like that, actually modeling the kinds of things you want students to do, I think goes a long way. I've always been amazed at how in different classes, the forum experience can go so differently term to term, even when nothing else changes, no TAs change, no policies change, because there's something that happens early in the semester that sets a different expectation. In fall, it was interesting. It was one student who posted, hey, I'm looking to form a study group in the San Francisco area. And what followed were about 30 threads of, I'm in Tokyo, I'm in New York, I'm in Atlanta, forming study groups. That had never happened in one of those classes before. But it was just one happening early on, leading to all these followers, these mimickers, things like that. And so I think having TAs, having you actually demonstrate what behavior you want students to engage in is valuable. The fourth is to be visible daily. One thing that's interesting that happens online is that students don't know what you're doing. When you teach in person, they see you in front of the class 3 times a week. They know, hey, he must care. He comes to class 3 times a week and actually talks to us. Online, you could read every single thing that's posted. You could read every assignment, check every grader's grades, but students never have to see you. And so if they don't see you, they don't know how involved you are. My heuristic is to try and post one thing per class that you're teaching per day. It doesn't have to be substantive. It doesn't have to be an answer. It doesn't have to be a long essay. It can be a cat gif. It can be, just a little throwaway comment. It can be, hey, that was a great presentation. Just something that says you were there and you were paying attention and you were present. I think goes a long way towards reassuring students that someone is at the wheel. And the fifth is to create a dedicated channel for feedback, because students are going to have thoughts, and the online environment empowers them to communicate them in ways that would be awkward in person. You're not usually going to have a student raising their hand in the middle of class saying, hey, that topic was really confusing and you did a really bad job of presenting it. But you'll have that online because it's a forum thread and it's not directed at you. It's, did anyone else find Dr. Joyner's presentation, that material particularly confusing? Creating a dedicated channel, I think, signals the students that you care about that feedback, that you're attending to it. And it also gives an avenue to channel it, because otherwise it's going to bubble under the surface until it gets significant enough to explode. And when it explodes in a big way, and in a way that is only really possible online, where students are empowered to say more than they would be in person. Plus, I think the nice thing about teaching online is also you have some opportunities to rapidly iterate on some things that you're doing. That you can do in person as well, but the online environment, because so much is documented and made permanent and made persistent, means that students can actually go back and say, am I just misremembering that lecture, or did he present that wrong? Oh no, I can actually go back and see that he misspoke about that. So it gives you a way of getting early feedback when it's actually actionable to improve the rest of the class. That's my babbling spiel. So if you have any questions, if you have any advice, any feedback, any thoughts that you have, here's my email address. I didn't want to give a quick plug because I was reading through y'all's introductions, and so many of you are from international audiences. We have a workshop actually at Learning at Scale this year. It's a global Learning at Scale workshop. It's the first time we've done it. It's really meant to get a better understanding of the way Learning at Scale is happening around the world. It came from some early observations of finding, in my presentations, I've always talked about how MOOCs aren't being accepted for college credit, but that's not true in China and India. There's great initiatives to make them more legitimate, more rigorous. And so it's an effort for us to understand and share more of what's happening with learning at scale outside of the big players that we usually hear about. So, pardon my yard work apparently. So that's all I have. I'm gonna read through questions real quick.
Thank you, David. We have a few questions. I think you can read through them. I can read through some of them. How do you balance the game of visibility and always being online?
That's a very good question, because I think that is something that I find happens sometimes, and it's kind of odd because I'll have someone say, I posted 4 hours ago about this question. I haven't got an answer yet. Yes, you posted at 11 p.m. on a Friday and you didn't get an answer by 3 a.m. No kidding. I think a large part of it is about setting that same kind of clear communication policy, but it's also back in the other direction. It's saying, these are the places we'll answer questions. These are the rate at which you can expect answers to questions. And anything better than this might be great. But this is the cadence of it. Many of the forum softwares or tools I see nowadays also have a nice feature where they actually let you queue answers and things like that. So you can actually go ahead and when you see a question, write the answer, but then queue it to post a bit later. So you can let some student discussion happen, or you can avoid the expectation that you're always online. Students can know David answers all his questions at 9 a.m. each morning, when in reality I answered them the night before. But unless there's something that really needs an answer right then, which usually won't be via Piazza, we use Piazza for ours. They'll know that's the expected pattern. But I think most of it is about expectation setting. It's also interesting though, when you're at our scale at least, the rate at which you can get answers is often very quick, because I have, in one of my classes, 18 TAs. And chances are at any given time, one of them is online. And I've had really interesting conversations with people about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Because it seems like having rapid feedback, rapid answers is great. But at the same time, it can become a bit of a crutch where students know, if I ever get stuck with anything, I don't need to struggle. I'll just go ask, and Josh will be online because he's fantastic and he's always online. So I think that's a place where I think it really depends on the nature of the course material. In my CS1 class, I encourage us to hold off a little bit and always give feedback in the sense of, here's how you can solve that problem yourself. Here's what I would do next if I was stuck where you are. In some of the more discussion-oriented classes, there's not as much reason to hold off, because you're contributing to something that's then going to snowball into more discussion. And if you intervene fast, people are going to build off of what you think. So
there's maybe the last question. Question about assessment of team project. I think there was lots of discussions about how to facilitate that work in groups, project-based learning, and how to assess that work. So a question from Takako about assessment team projects. How can we do open book assessment for team activity, or any kind of team activity should be done only as a supplement?
Yeah, I'd say that as I was talking about the group projects as well, I was aware that that's one tip that I think was more relevant when this was a very rapid transition. I threw out the group project because I was giving incomplete grades to like 10% of the class, because so many people were so rapidly affected by stuff. I think now that things are ideally a little bit more normal, it's fair to reintroduce it a little bit more. Ideally with an eye towards how you assess individual contributions to a team project, so that if you are stuck with someone who they had a more significant personal issue, you're not disproportionately affected by that. So I think that it is appropriate to reintroduce that. The tools are available to allow better collaboration. I think the question to be very thoughtful about is, what is the function of the team in that project? Is it to learn to act as a team? Is it to do something that can't be done individually, either because the skill sets need to be varied, or just the amount of work is not something that an individual can do? If you can't answer that question, it might be the case that it's not an appropriate place for team assessment. If you can answer that question, it also tells you how you have to manage team dynamics. If the question really is about learning to act as a team, then the team's grade may be the team's grade no matter what, because that's part of what you're trying to accomplish. If it is a case that it's about what your deliverable really is, then you might get into areas of, rate your teammate members, evaluate them, assess their contribution, things like that. That area though of measuring teammates' contribution, I think is a want to say it's an unsolved problem, but it's still a very big problem and a difficult to scale problem because there's so much that goes into it. There's so many times when, someone's going to say that a teammate didn't contribute when in reality they contributed just fine. They just didn't contribute in a way that the teammate liked, and things like that. I think that's a place where some individual intervention and early intervention, ideally, is the best approach, is to actually have students, instead of just saying at the end of a team project, this teammate did great, this teammate didn't contribute anything, have them do that as they go along so that you can actually intervene and say, hey, it sounds like you might not be contributing adequately to that project. You still have time to get better, to give more back before the final thing is due.
I hope that, as people are designing and working remotely and thinking about the fall, that there's data collected that speaks for what has worked under what conditions, so we can really learn from all of these experiences and continue to improve the experience, for more remote learning and blended learning going forward. Thank you so much, David. Thanks again. And we still have a couple of webinars as this series come along. So every other week we'll have one. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And again, thank you, David, for sharing all of this knowledge with us.